You don't deserve to die. My life growing up was full of pain and fear, all because of my parents. They would hit me, scream at me, and make me feel like I was worthless. There were many nights when I thought about ending my life to escape the misery they caused me. I wanted to be free from the hurt. But every time those dark thoughts crept in, I would repeat a mantra to myself: you don't deserve to die. It wasn't that I felt I deserved a happy life or any relief. I just believed that I didn't deserve the peace that death might bring. I convinced myself that enduring the pain and surviving every day was the only thing I could do to prove I was strong, even if that strength felt more like a curse than a blessing. Years passed, and I survived the abuse. I learned to numb myself to the pain, to detach from the world around me. My body carried the scars of every time I faced those dark thoughts and refused to give in. I made it my goal to outlive my parents and to see them become powerless. And eventually, that day came. My parents grew old and weak. Age took away their strength, the very strength they had used to hurt me for so many years. My father, once a fierce and towering figure, was now bedridden, unable to care for himself. My mother, who had screamed at me until her voice was hoarse, could now only manage a whisper. Their bodies were failing, leaving them helpless and dependent on me for everything. I became their caretaker. I fed them, cleaned up after them, and listened to their pitiful groans. The irony of it all was not lost on me. The power they once had over me was gone, replaced by their suffering and decay. They were in pain, and for the first time, they were asking for mercy. "Please," my father whispered one night, his voice barely audible. "Just end it. I can't take this anymore." My mother, her eyes hollow and filled with tears, begged me, "Please, just let us die." As I looked down at them, I didn't see the terrifying figures of my childhood. Instead, I saw two broken, pitiful people. It would have been so easy to give them what they wanted, to end their suffering. A pillow over their faces while they slept, a few extra pills in their food. It would be over quickly. But as I stood there, their pleas echoing in my ears, the words slipped from my lips, almost automatically. "You don't deserve to die." The mantra that had kept me alive all those years took on a new meaning. It became my truth, my sense of justice. They didn't deserve the peace of death, didn't deserve the release from pain. They deserved to suffer, just as I had. And so I continued to take care of them, making sure they had just enough to stay alive, but never enough to ease their agony. I watched as their bodies deteriorated further, covered in bed sores, their voices turning to weak whimpers. Every plea for death was met with the same response: "You don't deserve to die." The same words that had saved me from taking my own life were now a twisted kind of revenge. I was the one in control now, the keeper of their misery. I held the power to end their suffering, but I chose to let them live, to endure the pain they had inflicted on me. Day after day, I stood by their side, my mantra echoing in my mind. Their eyes became vacant, and their cries grew weaker, but still, they hung on to life, trapped in their bodies. I could have given them mercy and ended their pain, but I didn't. Because in the end, they didn't deserve to die. They deserved to live, to feel every ounce of suffering and despair they had once poured into me. They deserved to know that there would be no escape, no relief, just as there had been none for me.
The basement door. My whole life, my parents warned me to never open the basement door. They were always serious about it, saying it was for my own good. I never understood why they were so scared, but I listened to them. That all changed when they died in a car accident. After the funeral, the house felt too quiet, and my curiosity grew stronger. I kept thinking about the basement door and what might be behind it. Finally, one day, I couldn't resist anymore. I took the key and opened the door. The basement was dark and dusty, filled with old furniture and boxes. At first, it seemed normal, but then I noticed something strange on the wall, a faint outline of a hidden door. My heart raced as I walked over to it and pushed it open. Behind the door was a small, dark room. It smelled terrible, like something had rotted. There was an old bed with a dirty mattress and a metal bucket in the corner. The walls were scratched, and there were dark stains on the floor that looked like dried blood. It looked like someone had been kept in there, like a prison cell. Fear gripped me. Who had been in this room? Why was it here? I rushed out of the basement and called the police. When they came, they searched the room and took samples. They asked me lots of questions about my parents, but I didn't have any answers. I didn't know anything. 2 weeks later, a detective came to talk to me. He looked serious, like he had bad news. He sat me down and told me what they had found. "Charlie, we discovered that your parents were involved in something terrible," he said. "The room you found was used to hold children. Your parents were part of a child trafficking ring. They were kidnapping kids and selling their organs on the black market." I was shocked. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. My parents? The people who had raised me and loved me? How could they have done something so awful? The detective kept talking, but I barely heard him. My mind was spinning. The house that had always felt like home now felt like a stranger's place, full of dark secrets. The basement door stood open, reminding me of the horror I had uncovered. I had always thought my parents were protecting me from something terrible behind that door. But now I knew the truth. They were the ones I should have been afraid of all along.
The letter on the wall. I became a police officer because I wanted to make a difference, to help people, to protect them. I didn't join for the glory or the power. I joined because I wanted to feel like I was doing something good in a world that often felt cruel and indifferent. My first year on the force was busy and stressful. I saw things I'll never forget that kept me up at night, questioning why I had chosen this path. But now and then, I was reminded of why I became a cop. One of those reminders came in the form of a letter. It was from Mrs. Dawson, a woman I had helped when her teenage daughter, Lily, took her own life. I was the first officer on the scene. I'll never forget Mrs. Dawson's screams or the sight of Lily's lifeless body. I did everything I could to support Mrs. Dawson that day. I listened to her, comforted her, and made sure she wasn't alone. A week later, I received a letter from Mrs. Dawson thanking me for my support. It was heartfelt, saying how much it meant to her that I cared. She wrote about how I had given her some peace during a terrible time. I was deeply touched by what she said. It was the first time I felt like I'd made a difference. I framed that letter and hung it in my hallway, right by the front door. Every day, as I left for work and came home, I'd pass it. It was a reminder that, despite all the ugliness I saw on the job, there was a reason for what I did. I was doing good. The investigation into Lily's death didn't find anything suspicious. The suicide note was short and simple, expressing her despair and her decision to end her life. Everything seemed to point to a tragic but clear case of suicide. Mrs. Dawson's grief appeared real, and there was no evidence of foul play. For nearly 2 years, that letter hung on my wall. I would read it sometimes, especially on the hard days. It kept me going, knowing that I had made a real impact. But then, something strange happened. One night, after a tough shift, I was heading to bed. As I passed the letter, I stopped and glanced at it, like I always did. But this time, something caught my eye, something I had never noticed before. The handwriting. It looked familiar, too familiar. I stood there, staring at the letter, a cold feeling creeping up my spine. I knew that handwriting. I had seen it before. But where? My mind raced, flipping through memories until it hit me. The suicide note. Lily's suicide note. I had seen that handwriting before. My heart pounded as I rushed to my filing cabinet. I kept a copy of the note in my files, a habit for cases that stuck with me. My hands trembled as I pulled out the file and unfolded the note. The handwriting was identical. I couldn't believe it. It was the same handwriting, the same slant, the same loops and curves. Mrs. Dawson's letter and Lily's suicide note were written by the same hand. I felt the blood drain from my face as the realization sunk in. Mrs. Dawson had written the suicide note. But why? What did this mean? A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. I thought back to the day I found Lily. Mrs. Dawson had been hysterical, but now, looking back, something felt off. She had been too calm afterward, too controlled. I remembered how she had held me a little too long, how she had cried just a little too hard. My mind reeled with questions and possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. Had Mrs. Dawson killed her daughter? Had she written the suicide note to cover it up? The thought made me sick. All this time I had been proud of the letter on my wall, thinking I had helped a grieving mother. But what if I had been wrong? What if I had been helping a murderer? I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I spent hours staring at the letter and the note, comparing them over and over, hoping I was mistaken. But I wasn't. They were the same. The next day, I took both the letter and the note to my superiors. At first, they were skeptical. The investigation had already closed, no evidence and no leads. It was considered a suicide, and Mrs. Dawson's story had checked out. But after seeing the handwriting, they agreed to reopen the case. Further investigation revealed a darker truth. Mrs. Dawson had hidden her mental illness well. Neighbors and friends described her as controlling and manipulative. Lily had been planning to leave home, to escape her mother's control, but Mrs. Dawson couldn't bear it. In a desperate act, she had taken Lily's life and staged it as a suicide. The evidence was overwhelming. Mrs. Dawson was arrested and charged with murder. At her trial, the truth came out. Mrs. Dawson showed no remorse. Her defense claimed she couldn't live without her daughter. The jury found her guilty, and the judge sentenced her to death. The letter no longer hangs in my hallway. I took it down and burned it, watching the flames consume the words that once gave me pride. I still pass that spot every day, and each time, I feel a hollow ache in my chest. I learned a hard truth. Sometimes, the people you think you're helping are the ones you should be afraid of. Now, when I leave for work, I don't carry the same sense of pride. I carry a reminder of how easy it is to be deceived. How the people who seem most in need of help can sometimes be the ones hiding the darkest secrets. And how even in the pursuit of justice, there are wounds that will never truly heal.